Multicolor cards, sometimes called gold cards by the community, are some of the most popular cards in Magic. Thanks to being harder to cast, they're often made more powerful than the average monocolored card. That doesn't mean they're all winners though. There are a ton of multicolor cards that are just unplayable. And today we're going to go over some of the worst cards that cost multiple colors of mana. And starting us off at number 10, we have Reflect Damage. This is an instant with a mana cost of 3, 1 red, and 1 white. It is the effect where, the next time anything of your choice would deal damage this turn, it instead deals that much damage to its controller. Damage prevention is famously weak in Magic. Preventing damage is great when it works, either saving you from lethal damage or saving one of your creatures from dying. But it's difficult to have your damage prevention ready at the right time. This is why one of the best damage prevention cards in the game is Baron 10 Forge Tender, which has an activated ability to prevent damage that only requires you to sacrifice the Forge Tender, instead of paying any mana at all. If you're in a matchup where the damage prevention is useful, you can play it out early and just wait for the most opportune time to activate the ability, and never be caught without the mana you need to save something. It has protection from red, which in this case makes it very good against red aggro, as they can't get it out of the way early by burning it either. Reflect Damage is one of the most difficult damage prevention cards to use, as it costs a massive 5 mana. If you want to use Reflect Damage, you'll have to take off your entire turn, which is awful in most situations. Funnily enough, there is a power crept version of this card in Deflecting Palm that's actually seen some competitive play. It has an essentially identical effect, except it can only prevent damage that's done to you, and only costs 1 red and 1 white mana to cast. Palm is only a sideboard card for burn decks. It would be brought in against decks that plan to slam giant threats like Wurm Engine and Primeval Titan to play super early with a ton of mana ramp. You would use the first several turns trying to burn to lower your opponent's life total, and as soon as they try to attack you, you would use Palm to close out the game. This was especially important against cards like Wurm Engine that had a lifelink, which would normally give their controller life when they deal damage. So if you use Palm and prevent that damage, it's essentially a 12 life swing. Despite how strong this is, there are burn decks that don't use Palm because it requires generating a very specific scenario to be good. It's only good because it can literally win the game in the right circumstance, and that circumstance is somewhat easy to engineer in certain matchups. Reflect Damage is also power crept by Ink Shield, which prevents all combat damage that would be dealt to you for a turn and makes you a 2/1 Inkling token with flying for each damage prevented this way. It also costs 5 mana, so it's basically like Reflect Damage with way better upsides. But it's so hard to cast that it's not particularly good. It's only really used in Commander, and is seen more as a fun card than anything competitive, because a 5 mana damage prevention spell is just that hard to use. It's just that if it does work, it often literally wins you the game. Reflect Damage, on the other hand, is just as clunky, and the only upside it gives you is dealing some burn damage to the opponent. Reflect Damage isn't a terrible idea for a card, but there's a reason why future versions of it were made way more powerful. As it is, it's almost entirely useless. And at number 9, we have Illusory Demon. This is a 4/3 Demon Illusion, go figure, for 1 blue and 1 black. It has flying, so it can only be blocked by flying creatures, and has the ability where, whenever you cast a spell, you sacrifice Illusory Demon. Do we really even need to go over why this card is terrible? Demon may have slightly above average stats, but that doesn't really matter considering that you won't be able to do anything else without getting rid of it. If your opponent only ever casts any creature that's larger than Illusory Demon, you'll be forced to at least cast 1 spell, and at that point, the card will essentially hand your opponent a go for the throat. Even if they don't, if at any point you get behind on board, you'll also be forced to cast a spell. At some point, you're going to hand your opponent a free card worth of value and have to just hope that the damage the demon has done in the meantime is enough to close the game. This will almost never be the case, as even at the time, most creatures weren't that much worse than Demon is. If the card was, say, a 3 mana 5/5 or better, it might have been okay, because there are some ways to take advantage of a card like that. There are cards like Aether Vial that let you put creatures from your hand into the battlefield without casting them, so if you open the game with Vial and cast Demon on turn 3, you'd still be developing your board without sacrificing the Demon. Of course, if you lose your Vial, or don't open Aether Vial or any other card that lets you play without casting spells, Demon becomes useless again. And you're doing all this work just to get 5 mana worth of stats 2 turns early. If the payoff here was bigger, the card might be worth running outside of Limited. But honestly, it was probably only intended for that format. In Constructed, the stats just aren't worth the downsides. But in Limited, you might be able to get away with it here and there. Still, in the vast majority of circumstances, Illusory Demon is worse than any other creature. And at number 8, we have Reckless Assault. This is an enchantment for 2, 1 black and 1 red. It is the ability where you can pay 1 and 2 life to deal 1 damage to any target. Assault is actually pretty close to being a good card, but the costs are, once again, just too high for what this card does. Dealing 1 damage to something, or pinging, has proven itself to be a very strong effect on cards like Goblin Sharpshooter in the past. While it is a very small amount of damage, if you can do it multiple times, it can occur a lot of value over the course of a game. Reckless Assault makes it very difficult to actually use this ability multiple times. However, thanks to its very high life cost and mana cost on the ability, if you want to kill a simple 2 toughness creature, you have to pay a full 4 life, a fifth of your life total. By the time you actually cast Reckless Assault and untap to be able to use it, you've probably already lost some life against an aggro deck where this card would have been most useful. So paying this life to remove creatures isn't really practical. You also can't use it to burn your opponent, because you'll be taking more damage than they are at any point. However, if any of these numbers were slightly better, the card would probably be okay. If it only cost 1 life, it would be okay removal and burn. Or if it didn't cost mana to activate, you could play it out in turn 4 and kill all of your opponent's creatures by paying enough life. However, costing both a ton of your life and mana to activate makes it too easy to play against. This card isn't entirely useless though, because if your opponent is playing a ton of 1 toughness creatures, Assault is actually pretty good against them. You'll probably be a bit too low on life to use it still, but paying 2 life and 1 mana is a good deal to ping these 1 toughness creatures. However, the second they play anything with slightly more toughness, the card instantly becomes more of a burden than anything. And at number 7, we have Warping Wurm. This is a 1/1 Wurm for 2, 1 green and 1 blue. It has phasing, meaning that at the start of your turn, it phases out if it's not phased out, and phases in if it's phased out. While a card is phased out, it's basically treated like it doesn't exist, though most players treat Warping Wurm like it doesn't exist regardless of if it's phased in or out. During your upkeep, you have to pay 2, 1 green and 1 blue, or Wurm phases out, and whenever the Wurm phases back in, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. It's actually surprising how many downsides Wizard tacked onto the card that wouldn't have been playable without any downsides. Phasing is a purely negative ability for a card to have, making it so you can only attack or block with a card or activate any useful abilities it may have every other turn. To balance this out, the cards were supposed to be really powerful, with cards like Taniwa being a massive 7/7 for 5 mana in blue all the way back in 1996, which was an insane stat line for any creature at the time. Despite having actually good stats for their costs, basically none of the phasing cards were any good. Warping Wurm's stats are pitiful for its cost. It also requires a mana investment to keep around. Every turn you want to attack or block with Wurm, you have to pay another 4 mana, and at that point, basically any other creature is more efficient. The ability to slowly grow in size every time it phases in isn't anywhere near enough to make the card playable. For reference, Victory's Envoy costs 5 mana and puts a +1/+1 counter on every creature you control every turn, and has seen no competitive play at all. Of course, this is a card that came out after a lot of power creep. But still, you can make creatures that grow every turn around this mana cost a lot better than this without coming close to breaking anything. Wurm comes down as strong as a 0 mana creature, and very slowly will grow turn after turn, taking up the entire remainder of the game to grow to even a decent size. And then after all of that, you still have to pay extra mana to even be allowed to use the card you've already cast. Even if it gained an insane stat boost of +5/+5 at every upkeep, it still wouldn't be usable. Considering all of this, essentially any creature you could play that isn't actively harmful is better than Warping Wurm. And at number 6, we have Emberwilde Caliph. This is a 4/4 Djinn with a mana cost of 2, 1 blue and 1 red. It has flying and trample, so it can deal excess combat damage to defending player. And it has to attack every turn at Fable. Also, whenever it deals damage, you lose that much life. It is worth mentioning that, at the time, this was actually an above average stat line, especially with these abilities. However, that doesn't mean that it's appropriate to have this harsh of a downside on a card. Caliph will be dealing equal damage to both players in the absolute best case scenario. This is generally bad for you, as you're the one who cast the card and used resources to get into play. Of course, cards like this have sometimes been good. The most famous example is probably Flame Rift, which deals 4 damage to each player for only 2 mana. The theory is that you would play Flame Rift in an aggro deck with a lot of burn spells, so you'd not only be at a higher life total, but also capable of getting more damage through to your opponent afterwards. Essentially, for some decks, it's better for both players to have less life. However, this concept doesn't translate well over to Caliph, because it only comes down far too late. By the time you're casting something like Caliph, most mid-range decks have already attempted to turn the corner, so they're gonna be able to start pushing for lethal around this time. Even worse, Caliph is very exploitable, because it also deals damage to you when it blocks or gets blocked. This means that in a lot of situations, Caliph will be dealing more damage to you than it deals to your opponent, which is the exact opposite of what you want to happen. This is particularly bad on blocking, because no matter what you block, you'll lose a full 4 life. What makes this really weird is that Caliph comes from a long line of Djinns with downsides, such as Juzim Djinn, and in the early days of the game, these were some of the best creatures around. The Djinns were usually overstated creatures for their costs, but they each had a downside to balance this out. On most of the other Djinns, these downsides were actually reasonable, but for some reason, Wizards decided Caliph in particular was too good to simply deal 2 damage to you during your upkeep or something like that. Considering how many successful versions of this card they've already printed, it's weird that they decided that this Djinn specifically needed a ridiculously harsh downside to make up for having worse stats than a lot of the other Djinns. Whatever the reason, the result is one of the worst creatures we've ever seen. And at number 5, we have Suleiman's Legacy. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1 red and 1 white. It is the ability's where, when it enters, you destroy all Ifrits and Djinns, and they can't be regenerated. And whenever an Ifrit or a Djinn enters, you destroy them, and they still can't be regenerated. Now, after reading an effect like this, it's only natural to ask the question, well, how many Ifrits and Djinns are there? Well, there are a total of 59 Djinns and 28 Ifrits in all of Magic. And there are realistically only a couple of competitively viable ones. Back in the day, cards like Juzim Djinn and Urnham Djinn were quite good in the earliest days of competitive Magic. However, there aren't enough of them that anyone would be filling their deck with Djinns or Ifrits, and no real payoff for playing a Djinn or an Ifrit kindred deck. These cards have also been very power crept to the point where no one would ever play them. So in the modern day, you're even less likely to run into a matchup where this matters. This is a huge point, because the use of a card like Suleiman's Legacy would normally be a counter to a go-wide kindred strategy, but that's not really applicable here. Instead, it's basically a single target removal spell for 1 Djinn that might also blink some other cards in the opponent's hand. Sometimes. This is a pretty huge issue, because against the vast majority of threats your opponent would play wouldn't be of those types. Most of the time, you'd be the one with the dead card in your hand for most of the game. Now, funnily enough, there is a way to make Suleiman's Legacy a lot more powerful. By playing a card like Conspiracy and choosing Djinns or Ifrits, and then donating it to your opponent, then casting Suleiman's Legacy, you can make all of your opponent's creatures the correct type for Legacy, effectively locking them out from playing any creatures at all. Now, this is a fun combo you could do, but it's also so slow it won't actually be winning you any games. At least it's more interesting than most of the cards in this video. And if it affected a creature type that actually showed up somewhat often, it would be extremely powerful. The only real problem with the card is how narrow it is. And at number 4, we have Aether Rift. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 1, 1 red, and 1 green. It is the ability where, at the beginning of your upkeep, you discard a card at random. If you discard a creature card, you put it onto the battlefield. However, your opponent can pay 5 life to stop you from cheating that creature out. One of the longest standing traditions in Magic is giving red an absolutely unplayable red enchantment in every set, and Aether Rift is no exception to this trend. First off, the effect is completely random, because of course it is. This makes trying to cheat anything out with Aether Rift incredibly inconsistent. Sure, you can sometimes cheat out your Atraxa, but most of the time you're going to have too many cards in hand and will instead discard something completely useless like a land. This is pretty terrible, not only because you've lost a card, but also because if Aether Rift isn't cheating anything out, it's also essentially a wasted card. In order to get Aether Rift to work, you would have to find a way to dump a ton of useless cards out of your hand, or run enough creatures that you'll probably hit one every turn. However, even if Aether Rift does discard a creature, it often won't matter, because your opponent can just pay life to essentially kill the creature immediately. This makes trying to cheat out particularly huge threats essentially worthless. Hitting Eurochroma Angel of Wrath off your Rift is essentially just a less practical and more expensive Goblin Grenade. The best you can do is run a creature aggro deck with a Rift in it and just hope for the best, which isn't exactly a winning strategy. You'll usually only be saving around 2 or 3 mana at most whenever Rift does work. And whenever it doesn't discard a creature, it's actively hurting your chances of winning the game. Not to mention that this hypothetical deck needs to be almost exclusively of creatures, which is often difficult to accomplish. It's yet another card that mostly hurts you to play, but it's certainly not the last on this list. And at number 3, we have Malicious Advice. This is an instant with a mana cost of X, 1 blue and 1 black. It is the effect where you can tap up to X target artifacts, creatures, and or lands, and you lose X life. The only real malicious advice here is anyone telling you to put this card into your deck. Tapping permanents is an okay effect, but it's often pretty weak on non-permanent spells. This is due to the fact that this card is disadvantaged, as you're losing an entire card and your opponent only loses an opportunity to attack. Which is kind of weird considering that advice also makes you lose life. Why would you go through the effort of tapping your opponent's creatures to protect your life total with a card that's going to lose you life anyway? This loss of life also adds up quickly, and strangely makes it very bad against go-wide decks where this effect would normally be most advantageous. Being able to tap a lot of creatures for a single turn is one of the few ways to stop damage if your opponent spams a ton of tokens outside of board wipes, which blue and black won't always have access to. However, most tokens are 1/1s or 2/2s at largest, so you aren't actually stopping much, if any, damage. On the other hand, if your opponent is playing large creatures, you don't really need to tap X permanents because they probably only have a couple of threats out at most. Advice needs to find a situation where tapping a huge number of permanents is worth it, but that's very rarely the case. It's even more rare that you're okay with losing this much life to do so. Even worse, Advice has some of the stiffiest competition imaginable. Gigadrouse is a much better mass tapper, and blue and black have far better removal overall. Trying to find a situation where Malicious Advice is worth casting is extremely difficult, not to mention finding a place where it's competitive with other forms of interaction. And at number 2, we have Dragon Appeasement. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3, 1 black, 1 green, and 1 red. It is the ability where, whenever you sacrifice a creature, you draw a card, which is actually really good. Unfortunately, it also makes you skip your draw step, so this is just about the only way you'll be drawing cards. This is a high risk, high reward card, but unfortunately the reward isn't worth what you're giving up. The first major issue is this card's mana cost, which is far too high for a build around card. If you're building your deck around getting a ton of value off of Appeasement, you'll have a very hard time even surviving until turn 6 to get the card down at all. Even worse, the card is highly exploitable. If you tap out for Appeasement without a 0 mana way to sacrifice your creatures, and then your opponent removes all your creatures on the following turn, you'll be left with nothing and without the ability to draw any cards and dig for more action. This isn't a rare scenario either. Players often end up with empty boards in mid-range matchups, having traded all their resources for their opponents. If you're relying on Appeasement as your draw engine, you're likely only going to have it in hand in late game like this, and playing it at that point is essentially just asking to lose. Appeasement's ability is powerful, but it's so hard to get into play and so risky to cast that it's usually worth skipping. And this isn't even getting into the other options with similar effects. There are so many cards you can use in this card's place, from Grim Haruspex to Fecundity. Most of these cards also cost way less than Dragon Appeasement, which honestly makes you wonder why it was made so expensive anyway, considering it also has a huge downside. However, Appeasement can't even hold a candle to how terrible things get in the number 1 spot. And at number 1, we have Malignant Growth. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3, 1 green, and 1 blue. It has cumulative upkeep of 1, meaning every upkeep you have to put an age counter on it. Then you sacrifice it unless you pay its upkeep cost for each age counter on it. During your upkeep, you also have to put a growth counter on it. And during each opponent's draw step, they draw a card for each growth counter on Malignant Growth. Then it deals 1 damage to them for each card they drew this way. Growth is a combination of multiple terrible effects onto a single card. First of all, cumulative upkeep is a terrible mechanic that makes almost any card with it bad immediately. The upkeep cost will grow every single turn, far faster than you can get lands into play to pay for the cost, so you'll have to get rid of it eventually. Of course, needing to get rid of growth sooner rather than later might not be a bad thing, considering that its effect is actively detrimental in most games. Malignant Growth is basically a Phyrexian arena for your opponent that grows every turn. It gives them a constant stream of card advantage in exchange for a small amount of life, a trade that basically anyone would make in a heartbeat. This might be an interesting burn strategy if the amount of damage it dealt was even slightly reasonable, but 1 damage per card is just not even close to enough to be relevant. Any deck with a good number of creatures will just swarm the board with threats and start attacking you, which you wouldn't be able to defend yourself against because you'd be paying all of your mana and keeping growth on the battlefield. To add insult to injury, the first turn you play growth, it literally does nothing. It won't have any growth counters on it, so you just have to pay 5 mana, wait a turn, and pay 1 for cumulative upkeep, and then you will get a growth counter, and then next it will finally start dealing damage to your opponent. Growth is one of the few cards that's essentially all downside, more so than any other multicolor card in Magic. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any of the cards you think we may have missed, or have ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.